Welcome, everybody, to the Journey Conversations with publisher Kris Millegan. I am your co host, Adam, otherwise known as A.W. Finnegan. Today, we will be talking to Jay Dyer. Jay Dyer is an author, comedian, and TV presenter known for his analysis of Hollywood, geopolitics, and culture, and co writer for The Sam Hyde Show. His graduate work focused on psychological warfare and film, and he is the author of two books, Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2, with a third coming out, and the co-creator and co-host of the television show Hollywood Decoded. He has been featured on numerous popular shows and podcasts and in debates with some of the world's top debaters and a fill-in host for some of the largest U.S. radio shows. And now your host, publisher, Kris Millegan.
Thank you, Adam, very, very much. And thank you, Jay, for spending some time with us here. These are interesting times, to say the least, a lot going on, a lot to look at. And, I guess I didn't realize your dissertation was about psychological warfare because, that's been one of a very main interest of mine ever since my daddy and a professor took me in a room and blew my mind, told me stuff that it took me 20 years to understand, but led me on a interesting path. So, Jay, psychological warfare. What got you interested in psychological warfare?
I didn't know what that was until probably college. I remember I'd watched a lot of movies that I liked growing up in high school, and I remember, enjoying Oliver Stone films and, stuff like that, and conspiracy movies like Dick Donner's Conspiracy Theory with Mel Gibson. And I remember when I got to college, I took some classes on the connection between Hollywood and the history of Hollywood, some film classes as well as just straight up history classes. And I remember that coming up in some of the classes. And then I remember somehow I got a hold of one of the TrineDay books back when I was an undergrad. And I remember reading you published Sutton's Skull and Bones book. And I remember you published the Lavenda trilogy, and I got a hold of that trilogy. Somebody bought me that, I think, for my birthday. And I read that whole trilogy, and I thought, well, this is crazy. This is wild. So that got me interested in psychological warfare. And at the same time, I was taking these, college classes, and I had a professor who was an old school leftist. He was a history professor, and he taught us a lot about CIA operations, Latin South America, that kind of stuff. So that was kind of my introduction, was undergrad college. I don't consider myself an expert, but that got me interested in just this whole domain of the overlap of what the military and what intelligence agencies and what corporations are interested in. And then you've got this other realm over here of, movies and Hollywood, and even fiction writers, British intelligence fiction writers. They did the same stuff where they would, put their some of the elements of their operations into the novels that they wrote. So that was what got me interested, was just a combination of books and some of your materials that you had published back in the day, and college classes and movies.
Yeah. I mean, psychological warfare comes from the German term meaning, worldview warfare. In other words, you want to get people invested into your worldview and different things. And we've had this, geopolitical things have been going on well before we were all born, and now it's very interesting too. I had the executive producer of 24, call me up one day and say, hey, I think that this series is being used to propagandize the American people. I mean, those were his words to me. And, wow. And he had felt that. And so he went out on the internet and started looking around, and he found a bunch of our books. And so, he tried to make them into movies, and he was stopped. Okay. I mean, I'll tell just a little bit of the story. I mean, he called me up one time and, you know, said he was being chased around town by a white SUV and he couldn't shake it. And this guy was driving a Ferrari. Another time he calls me up and says, you know, we've got to redo all of our banking things because most of their money was coming from a Mexican national. And so, because of some laws, they had to really change it, but they kept on working on these books. Um, Michael Rupert walked into their office and said, "You can't make these movies." And we hadn't even talked about it, okay? And says, "You got to make a movie about me." Okay, Rupert. And then he finally calls me up one day and says, "You know, well, another time he called me up and says, they're trying to get me fired. They're saying that, you know, I'm out on Sunset selling OxyContin at night. My boss knows that's not true." So they kept on working on him. Finally, he calls me up and says, "Well, I've got to go on a sabbatical for 2 weeks." And I say, "Okay, what's going on?" He says, "Somebody met his wife on a street corner and said, you know, if you don't stop what you're doing, we're going to kill your husband and then you. What are your children going to do?" Okay. And I said, "Okay." And he went on a sabbatical and called me back up in about 2 weeks and said, "Well, I guess we're just making Will Ferrell movies." Uh, so obviously there are some people that have some vested interest on what comes out from Hollywood.
Yeah.
And what comes out from Hollywood, Jay?
A lot of propaganda. I think you summed it up right there. I didn't, of course, most of us didn't know this growing up. I know you had a OSS, father, or is your father or grandfather? I don't remember what.
No, it was father. He was
Yeah.
COI, OSS,
So
G2, and CIA.
did
And
you
then
you
he
probably
got,
knew a lot of this before everybody else, I would assume.
well, I had an inkling. I mean, he told me about his intelligence career, and he basically he gave me some information that led me to look into the subject I call CIA drugs, which then led you to all kinds of different
Yeah.
places because those people were involved in a lot of the corruption.
Right. Yeah. I just had a similar situation. I know this is not on the topic of the question, but my uncle had a really interesting career. He was an Air Force intelligence person, and my family didn't tell me this until way later on. And they told me all the stuff he was involved in, which I had an inkling of that too, but they didn't tell me until I was much older. I think I was about age 35 before they told me all that. But there was some, similar things there with, I don't know about drugs, but there was definitely some um, operations that were being done that he did in the Cold War out of Turkey in regard to the Soviets. But regardless, when you go back into the 40s and the 50s, one thing I've learned more recently that I think is really fascinating is a lot of these A-list people were recruited into the OSS, especially, famous Hollywood people working in different capacities and doing different things with the OSS, and then obviously into the CIA as well. So when I learned that kind of shocked me. I was kind of surprised by that. And that's maybe just one element of the angle of the propaganda. You've got people within Hollywood spying on each other during World War II and then into the Cold War. And then you've got people at the production level working with people from the OSS and CIA as well. The OSS helped, for example, John Ford, if I recall, win some of his awards. He would not have won those awards if he had not had such help from the OSS. So that's an element of, of propaganda that was going on there. I believe it was Bernays that said Hollywood is the greatest engine of propaganda the world's ever seen. And then, of course, you've got a lot of influence from foreign countries. We can imagine what foreign countries, Israel and other countries, as we get into the Cold War, they have a lot of influence in Hollywood, especially when it comes to productions about the Cold War. I'm not pro-communist or Soviet, but I definitely think there was exaggeration going on. So, World War II, you've got Corda Circle, you've got Hitchcock, you've got those guys putting out propaganda. You've got Cold War, you've got CIA putting out consulting on movies, recruiting actors, there's no end to the propaganda, and corporations as well. Corporations, of course, have a lot of influence and interest as we get closer to, where we are now, more so maybe than governments even determining what themes films will have, what narratives, what product placement. Think of something like the CIA consulting on Ben Affleck's Argo, which won the award, the Academy Award that year, and that was, of course, based on this CIA operation to have a fake movie being filmed during the 1979 hostage crisis in Iran. So these are just windows into the propaganda at different levels that we're talking about.
Right. So now, is it called Lookout Mountain, that studio that was up at the top of the canyon? And, that was an obvious facility that they were using to produce, and then also to, integrate the Hollywood people in there. And I mean, it's very interesting that, Ronald Reagan, all the training films for World War II and whatnot, he was basically the narrator for those, okay, which gave his voice, into a lot of people so they would trust him and blah, 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 blah. And then you had, for the CIA films, who was the narrator for that, but Moses Heston, Charles Heston and whatnot. So what do you know about that facility, and what is it doing today?
Yeah, of course, just from an artistic perspective, I enjoy. I don't think I've ever watched a Ronald Reagan movie, but I definitely enjoyed a lot of those Charlton Heston movies growing up. But I wouldn't be surprised, I think he was friends with Dr. Jolyon West, which is an odd connection. But I think, Charlton Heston probably had some of those ties, shall we say, as do many A-listers still to this day. But yeah, you're talking about Lookout Mountain Studios, which was, if you drive up Wonderland Avenue up into, if you're coming from LA and you drive up into Topanga Canyon, you can go up that route and you get up to the very top. We've gone up there many times since I wrote the first book. And you can still see some of the elements of the old Air Force stuff that the different owners, I think it's passed from various Hollywood celebrities, have owned this facility now, the last being Jared Leto. There's still some of the old Air Force memorabilia there that you can see over his fence. I wasn't stalking him or anything, but you can peek over the fence. You can peek over the fence and see some of the old Air Force stuff there. But yeah, this was the most cutting edge studio of its time back in the 50s and 60s. And all of these Hollywood executives had access to it. Walt Disney, starlets like Marilyn Monroe could go there. We don't even know all the films that they did produce there or what all was produced there. But some of the things that have come out, you can still find on YouTube. They have some of the propaganda movies that Jimmy Stewart did. He did a lot of the voiceovers. He's in a lot of the, those were pro FBI type films. He actually starred in a few of those FBI propaganda films back in the day. So yeah, I mean, that's a great one to demonstrate just this key tie-in between corporations and Hollywood, the studio system, the deep state government system, and what they're churning out. And you've got basically the top people at the time driving up here to that, and then driving back to the other studios. So it's a big complex that's all intertwined, and that's one of the key ways to prove that.
Right. Now, you do a lot of well, I don't know about exposés, but expositions, I would say, about different movies in your books. And one thing that just I like movies. I thought they were great. They'd be on TV. You'd watch them and different things. And one thing that I started thinking about, because when you look at Hollywood and LA, I mean, there's always been a lot of cults and interesting people around there. And when you're making a movie, and you're making a movie about some of these occult and devil type themes, it seems to me that the whole movie set becomes, to a certain extent, a place to have rituals and to do quote unquote workings when they're doing these movies. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Absolutely. I think if it might have been Sinister Forces trilogy where I first heard that idea, or maybe it was some other article somebody had written a long time ago. I don't remember, but when you look into the way that people who do ritual magic who are interested in that subject matter, when they see their actions or even their artwork, even something like a film could be seen as a ritual action. So you're putting your will and your intention out there into the world through this product to try to get your worldview accepted. You mentioned, Weltanschauungskrieg, worldview warfare earlier. That's kind of what is going on from a propaganda perspective with movies, but also you could be trying to put out your worldview in a more symbolic, occult way, like you're talking about. And so the first chapter or section of the third book, I called it Hollywood as Magus or Magician, because there's a classic novel that's in the canon, Western canon literature, called The Magus by John Fowles. And he's famous because he wrote a really well-known serial killer story. But the Magus is interesting because you have this character who's kind of an Aristotle Onassis billionaire guy who kind of can engineer everything in regard to this one guy's life that he's kind of messing with. So he's this wealthy guy who has nothing else to do other than to kind of mess with young idiotic guys and bring them to their to your billionaire island and sort of tweak their worldview and see what you can get them to believe and not believe. And so I said, well, that character, I think his name is Conchis. He's kind of an image of the way Hollywood works. Hollywood's the same kind of a thing where it's kind of giving us this worldview throughout all these stories, a lot of propaganda, a lot of bad messages, some good messages here and there slip through, but probably fewer good than bad. But I think you also have directors, to be more precise, who are explicitly into ritual magic, who have the idea that they're actually participating in ritual workings. Somebody like Darren Aronofsky, who pretty clearly is into Kabbalah. Kubrick, you could debate that. I've had some discussions with Vivian and his daughter, and I keep trying to get her to come do an interview, but she's real hesitant to do that. But I think that clearly Kubrick included some of these themes. How serious he took any of that is up for debate. But other directors are more well known. I think David Lynch definitely included Tibetan Buddhist themes. He included transcendental meditation themes. So in those examples, it's clear. More recently, Robert Eggers, that directed The Witch and Nosferatu. I mean, I think he's pretty clearly a Crowleyan of some kind. So yeah, that's what's going on at multiple levels once again.
Right.
And you
Right.
had that whole like vampire thing that became really big.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
all occult things aren't, it's a thing like a gun. I mean, it's not, evil or bad. It's what people do with it, because it is a reality of what happens in our life. And I'd like to just go to a different place here just for a little bit. I'd like to talk about advertisements that we see on TV. Okay, because I think that's one of the main ways that they're radicalizing people and getting people into camps. And one of the main ways that they're messing with us is advertisements on TV. Do you have any thoughts about that?
It's a good one that I didn't really cover. I focused on sort of major films, TV shows, and some independent films and B movies. But I think that's actually a good overlooked point. At music industry too, music videos, which are not as popular as they used to be. But it's funny. I got rid of quote TV probably 15, 20 years ago. I just got rid of it. And so I don't see a whole lot of TV
either.
Yeah. I like when I go over to somebody's house or if we're eating at a restaurant, what that's really annoys me too. You can't go to a restaurant now without TVs everywhere, which is that to me is dystopian. We should be able to have a meal without having to watch, sports and ads. So I do see ads here and there. And one thing I noticed, at least in the last 10 years, is pharmaceutical ads everywhere. I mean, it's just
Oh
like
yeah.
you can't even turn the channel without seeing just constant pharmaceutical, which to me is very Brave New World, very dystopian. The idea that there's a pill for every single thing going on in your life. I think we're meant to have depression at times in life. We're meant to have bad experiences that helps balance out with the good experiences. So the idea that you should medicate yourself at all times to have no experiences is kind of kind of crazy to me. But advertisements also have a lot of odd themes of men are usually in this sort of women role, or they're subservient. The women are always bossing the men around. The men are all idiots. They're all Homer Simpson. They're all, Al Bundy type characters who are just total idiots. Advertisements probably, well, I mean, they just kind of further the whole idea of just endless, infinite, consumption and consumerism. So I think you're absolutely right that advertisements are overlooked, and adds to a lot of the directors who became kind of prominent directors. Many of them began with advertisements. David Fincher, I think he went from ads and music videos to being one of the top sort of directors. That it's pretty nihilistic. Most of his movies are pretty dark and nihilistic. So that's a good point, Kris. I should have I should have.
And then they also got into things like subliminal messaging. I remember that
That's
book
true.
by Jim Keith. What was that book? Jim Keith put that book out about mind control. I have over here something.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but
Secret and
they did
Suppressed.
Mass control.
Yeah.
mass
Yeah.
control. That's
Right,
the
right,
one.
right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And it just, it's part of the whole toxic soup.
Yeah,
Okay. But then movies, I mean, it's like, the quote unquote powers that be have, tried to stop me many times and tried to put us out of business because, they don't like us publishing books, but, it's hard to stop stubborn people sometimes. And then also, but when it gets to movies, they move in with the big guns and stop it because everybody goes to the movies. I mean, we have kids and we try and raise them and whatnot, but they listen to the movies more than they listen to the parents most of the times. And then, you'll see how the movies take a life of their own in the society where people are relating what's going on in the world to the movies, and they're making, so it's really quite a, I don't know, toxic soup. So, Adam, what are your thoughts and all of this and comments?
yeah. It's like I I'm like him. I got rid of my TV a while back, and I just read all the time. Like I love books, and talking to other people, it became apparent to me. People are so used to having the TV and stuff. It's that a lot of people can hardly even read a page. They're just like, oh, I don't, It's like we've been really just kind of dumbed down and almost like a trance. The TV kind of puts them into a trance, and
yeah.
yeah, it's something else. I mean, I like movies though. I do watch movies and stuff. It's just I have a TV here, but it's never on. Like I barely even use it. I'm always reading, and I keep a long list of every book I read. I keep a list, and that's my way. But yeah,
Well,
some people just love
yeah,
that
my
TV.
daddy told me, he said, read it all. So, I look at it now. I mean, I'll watch the news from the different outlets to see what they're saying because, he told me you learn so much from mis and disinformation about where they're trying to send you and why,
Mm,
and then what they're not telling you too, So,
hmm
and Jefferson he said, he did a little bit more flowery, but basically, you have to do your homework because if you don't do your homework, good chance you're going to be played, you know, and whatnot. So, uh, now Jay, you came from a philosophy background you studied a lot of philosophy in college. Um, what what can we learn from philosophy? Why should we care about philosophy? What does it mean to today's world?
That's a good question. So the key issue of philosophy is what is the meaning of life? What is the examined life, right? So if you go back to Socrates and Plato, Socrates made a lot of people mad in Athens because he went around asking questions. And the classic dialogue is Plato's Apology, which is about this story of Socrates walking around and asking everybody, what's the meaning of this? Why are you doing this? What's the meaning of life? And he went to all the different people in Athens, including politicians and craftsmen and tradesmen. And everybody has the same answer that whatever they're interested in or whatever they do is the answer to life. And that's the meaning of everything. So the politician, of course, says, well, life is politics. And then the tradesman says, well, life is about, your craft and your trade. And eventually it goes to the Oracle of Delphi and says, who's the wisest man? And the Oracle says, you are. And he says, well, why am I the wisest man? I don't know anything. And the point was that, well, you're the wisest man because you ask the questions, why? Right. So one of the things that philosophy does, it's sort of its essence, is getting us to ask, why is this happening? What is this? What's the meaning of life? The examined life, as Socrates says, as Plato says, is the only life worth living. So that's the basics. And then as you get into more advanced modern types of philosophy, you get the idea of critical thinking and logic and analysis, which points out things that don't make sense, contradictions. So although we might not think that philosophy has much to do with advertising or propaganda, if we recognize fallacious arguments, bad arguments, they help us to identify the propaganda. For example, go back to weapons of mass destruction. The story, for example, of that propaganda firm that Bush Sr. was involved in that had the Iraqi ambassador daughter go up there and say that he's throwing the babies out of the incubators. So we got to go to war because supposedly there's weapons of mass destruction, balls of gas that Saddam has, and he's throwing babies out of incubators. Well, on the surface of it, it's kind of absurd. Why would Saddam walk through and just throw babies out of incubators? It doesn't make any sense. And then, of course, if we knew a little bit of the history, we'd know that, well, Saddam has a history of being trained by the CIA, and he's, pictured in buddies with Rumsfeld, the Pentagon. So it's like we would know that there's something about that doesn't make any sense, and it's an absurd story on its face. And then we'd be able to notice contradictions in the narrative. Well, why would we be friends with Saddam, or why would we be friends with the Mujahideen? And then suddenly they're our enemies the next day. So something doesn't make sense there. Something else is going on. And philosophy just helps you kind of at a really basic level, use critical thinking to not be duped by advertising tricks or propaganda, which plays on your emotions, right? You hear this story of babies are thrown out of incubator. We got to go after saying they did the same thing with Assad, right? Assad is gassing his own people. And the BBC puts out this story, and later, it turns out that BBC story wasn't true. And so, wartime propaganda always utilizes these really hyped up, emotional, sensationalist stories. And philosophy could help recognize how that doesn't make sense. And movies push the propaganda. They pull on your heartstrings through the stories, and you identify the bad guys through these movies that unknowingly propagandizes you against, XYZ enemy.
Right. I would say that philosophy kind of also helps you put yourself in your own story, kind of like we've been talking about with those round tables about putting yourself in your own story, writing your own story for your life. And philosophy helps you gravitate to where you kind of need to be at.
Right. And so in conspiracy literature, there's a lot of talk about Hegel, and they think Hegel is a bad guy. And, Hegel was really just, trying to explain things. And can you talk about Hegel a little bit so people can hopefully understand a little bit more rather than just going for a quick bullet point.
Yeah, I think with most with most philosophers, there's good and bad, pros and cons. You know, with Plato, he could be used for the idea of the individual coming to enlightenment through rational, process and thinking and dialectics. And it could also be turned into the Plato's Republic becoming some kind of proto, communist super state. Philosophers can be used in different ways. Hegel is very dense. It's very abstract. It's very idealistic, not in the sense of an idealistic revolutionary, but idealistic in the sense of everything that exists is mind, Geist, or idea, or spirit, as he says. So he's somewhat similar to Plato, but one of the things that he wanted to do was reconcile the idea of change or process versus everything being in a pure static, immobile sense that Plato thought about the real world or the forms. So for Plato, this is a changing, fluctuating world, and the real world is the ideal realm of the forms. So Hegel has to be understood in a context of wanting to reconcile and fix some of what he saw as old philosophical problems that were still lingering. So if Hegel thinks that dialectical process in terms of the world itself helps to explain where the world is going, what's happening, how everything is mind or spirit at root, and that in his mind, in some way, eventually everything would sort of culminate into some sort of what he called an omega point, which is some kind of everything becoming one. It's kind of, mystical. It's kind of unclear, but Hegel's used then by people like Karl Marx, who just sort of flips Hegel and gets rid of all the spirit Geist stuff and says, Hegel's right about all the stuff he's talking about dialectics furthering the whole process of the world, moving towards its purpose, but it's not spirit and all this mystical mumbo jumbo. It's just matter and motion. So that's where Marx takes Hegel and turns him on his head. But at root, Hegel is just a kind of process philosophy or theology that is rooted ultimately in elements of Hermeticism and Kabbalah. That's actually been demonstrated now in some recent academic literature, who are Hegel historians and philosophers. So that's the process philosophy that Hegel's philosophy is a bunch of little triangles where thesis and antithesis come together to produce a higher order of synthesis, which is a more true revelation than the previous partial knowledge, right? So that might be a little abstract, but that's really the whole Hegelian system. And Hegel doesn't just think that you or I interacting right now in that way is furthering the dialectic. Everything in the world is operating to further this dialectic towards ultimate synthesis at some future endpoint in time. Thus, Hegel could be used by a Nietzschean, he could be used by a communist, he could be used by a transhumanist. Any of these philosophies could sort of take that and say, hey, this is our end goal. I mean, the Reich, some of the philosophers of the Reich liked the idea of Hegel, and they said, hey, what Hegel's saying is our Reich is the end goal of history. Marx could say the withering away of the state is the end goal of history. So he could be used by various people.
Right. Now, I don't know, rightly or wrongly, but I look at a dialectic basically as one of our fail-safe devices that we have all as a group, because I'll say some things I know are true about secret societies, drug running, and intelligence agencies, and I'll find somebody that's a spook saying something a little bit more outrageous. He'll put lies in it, because by controlling the extremes you control the middle.
Yes.
And whatnot. So thank you. I really appreciate all this talk about philosophy. It always helps me to understand things. And but let's get back to your books, Esoteric Hollywood 1, Esoteric Hollywood 2, and the soon to be come out Esoteric Hollywood 3. And now, how do people find you, and what all are you doing out there? You have some you do interviews and whatnot. How do people find you and whatnot?
Yeah, I'm on the major social media outlets except for Facebook. I'm not a huge fan of Facebook, so I mean, there's still a page there, but I don't really pay much attention to it. I'll update it every now and then. Mostly I'm on YouTube now. That's kind of the biggest platform. So I do live streams and videos almost every day, maybe every other day. That kind of became the main outlet for me. But I'm also on Instagram and I'm on Twitter. So people can find me on all those places, and now TikTok as well. But um, yeah, so you can find me there. You can get access to, the previous books in the shop at my website, jaysanalysis.com. All my stuff is there, all the archived lectures and interviews and talks the last 10 years or so. In the shop, you could click on the shop tab and you get the two Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. But yeah, I mean, it's been a wild ride for the last 11 or almost 10 years. The first one came out in 2016, so we're 9 years out of Esoteric Hollywood 1. I'm really thankful to you for seeing the potential of that and publishing that. I think it went for a great run. And then part 2 was great as well. It was a little bit different. So in 1, we focused on a lot of the directors like Kubrick, Hitchcock, Spielberg, sort of the main players in terms of directors. And then in part 2, it was more thematic, where I talked about organized crime and I talked about mafia. We talked about intelligence agencies in Hollywood, geoengineering, even how that's portrayed in film. And then this more recently, part 3 will be focusing on some of the same material, but I decided to divide it up into areas that I never really got to in the first 2 that were really important. So we've got comic books. I had so many people messaging and DMing over the years. Hey, you're not covering comic book movies. Those are really big. Those are really important. And, comic book films took over Hollywood maybe for the last 20 years when it comes to, blockbusters, Marvel films. I liked comic books when I was a kid. I'm not a huge comic book fan anymore as an adult. But for whatever reason, this just took over. And then Disney bought out Marvel. So it's just a massive thing. And they're pretty heavy with propaganda. I would say back in the 2000s, they were a little more revelatory in terms of good ideas. And then as we got, more and more up to where we are now, they're pretty much almost unwatchable. So I haven't watched a lot of the more recent, 3 or 4 years of comic book movies, but I did watch throughout the 2000s and 2010s, most of them. So I try to pick out some of the ones that were really interesting, including the Christopher Nolan films. I think he's a pretty good director, hit and miss when it comes to some of them, but he has a lot of Jungian themes that we highlight in his Batman trilogy, and then we go into dystopian films that I never got to, Mad Max, that kind of stuff. And then an emerging archetype I wanted to cover that not a lot of people have noticed, except for some of my friends at the PsyOp Cinema podcast. They have highlighted this theme of this sort of dark goddess that's emerging through a lot of films in the last 20 or 30 years. So we did a whole section on that, a whole section on independent and B movies that I thought were worth people's viewing if they were interested in this idea of truth in B movies. And then Hollywood alchemy, horror trauma. I wanted to hit some of the classics like True Detective, which was pretty dark, had obvious, Crowleyan, satanic cult themes there. And then it's some more on key propaganda in Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible stuff. All that's based on E. Howard Hunt, and his background, his history. And then some elements of Hollywood spies, actors who've been recruited into intelligence work. And then a little bit on Hollywood Antichrist and how that's been portrayed in various films. I think we're kind of at the end of the old model of the studio system. I mean, you've had a lot of directors like Spielberg and others coming out saying the old studio system is pretty much done. It's going away. Nowadays, it's Apple Studios, Amazon Studios. So the tech companies are kind of buying out, taking over old Hollywood. And also movies are a lot less popular with Gen Z, the younger people. They scroll TikTok all day and they play video games. So right. I think that they don't care as much about movies. So it's kind of synchronicity, I guess you could say, that this last one that we wrote that I wrote here. Well, there might be more, I don't know, but part three ends up being sort of at the end of the old Hollywood system. So it's apocalyptic. It's an end of the era. So I think it's a fitting kind of title.
Right, right. And well, and I do think that they are moving some of that propaganda stuff into the video games. And so let me ask you a question here. What would you now, you've gone through all this and this research, what would you tell your own self, 10, 15 years ago? What have you learned that's, really profoundly affected you?
That's another good question. I think so. In the first series of essays in part one, there was a lot of speculation and a lot of symbolic interpretation that it's not that it's bad. It's just a little kind of speculative, shall we say. And I think nowadays I would have found it a lot more interesting to have written more about, but at the same time, there wasn't a whole, 10, 15 years ago, there was even less information out about people in Hollywood and their ties to intelligence. I would have focused more on some of the stuff that I put towards the end of this third book, had I known about it. I think that's more interesting, maybe even than some of the propaganda in the films. But I think that comes with age too. You get a little more mature. You're more interested in, well, it's actually more interesting that, Julia Child's working with the OSS or, somebody like, I don't know, Jimmy Stewart, working for the FBI. That's a little more interesting than, this movie over here with this symbol over here, which is not that that's not interesting. It's just, I would have focused more on that. I would have looked more at, modern people, I think some of these big A-listers themselves have been perhaps doing, I think people like Sean Penn or people like George Clooney, those kind of A-list people could have been more interesting as a focal point, even back then, if I'd known about it. Maybe some of the production companies, some of the actual operations that were done apparently about using movies as covers, that could have been, I think, a better approach. Less of the speculation, I guess.
Yeah. Well, somebody comes up and tugs on people's patriotic heartstrings, and you can get them to do most anything. Adam, you have any last thoughts here about this interview?
No, this was a great time. Hopefully, maybe I can get you on TrineDay Treasures. I do a new podcast for TrineDay authors and stuff. Maybe down the line we can do.
Yeah, sure, anytime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Jay, I want to thank you very much for your time. And, people, if you want some education, check out Jay on YouTube and check out his books and anything, and onwards to a better future for our children.